To conclude our summary notes episode 3, we're going to go ahead and talk about lesson 1.2D, or the concepts that you covered in lesson 1.2D. So in the beginning of your notes, or part of your notes section, talked about the difference between a common difference and a common ratio. With that being said, for the common difference, what's important to notice, or for both, is that we're talking about the range of a function, or the range, the numbers, or the outputs that are being listed. So to remember range, remember we are looking at the outputs, which are our y values. Our outputs are our y values. So range, again, they are outputs or our y values. And so what I needed you to understand from this part is what is different from a common difference versus a common ratio. So when we go ahead and we look at the range here, I see that I have fancy brackets, and what's listed is 0, 5, 10, and 15. So with this range, I need to decide whether they, or these numbers in this sequence, have a common difference or common ratio. So when I look at 0 to 5, I notice a change of adding 5. 0 plus 5 is 5. And then when I look from 5 to 10, I too see that there's a change of adding 5. And finally, 10 to 15, adding 5. So because I am adding a number to get from one part of my range to the next part, this is what's called a common difference. So a common difference is when you add, so I'm going to use a add and a plus sign, or subtract, so using a minus sign, the same number. So basically, when you're looking for a common difference, you're looking for a pattern where you add or subtract. So I'm going to highlight the word common difference in yellow because that's an important vocabulary word. And then I'm going to highlight the pattern of adding or subtracting the same number to help me remember that. So then when I jump down to a common ratio, again, I'm looking at my output values here. So how I go from 27 to 9, and 9 to 3, and 3 to 1. And when I think of the pattern that I see is I am thinking of dividing. When I take 27 and I divide it by 3, I end up at 9. And when I take 9 and I divide it by 3, I end up at 3. And 3 divided by 3 is 1. So what I found here is that these numbers are all divisible by 3. So that's my common pattern. However, for a common ratio, the way that we write it is in terms of multiplication. So instead of writing 27 divided by 3, I need to think of what is dividing by 3 in terms of multiplication. Well, when I do that, I can understand or come to find out that when I take 27 and I multiply by 1/3, I end up at 9. And when I take 9 and I multiply by 1/3, I end up at 3. And finally, when I take 3 and I multiply by 1/3, I end up at 1. And I can continue this on and to find smaller and smaller numbers in this set of range or set of output values. So here I find what's called a common ratio, because what I end up doing is I'm multiplying by a specific, or multiplying by the same number. So up here I'm going to write the word multiply, and I'm going to use the dot symbol to kind of get away from using x, because I don't want you to get that confused with the variable. But here I'm multiplying by the same number. So again, I'm going to take my yellow highlighter, highlight the word common ratio in yellow, and then take purple this time and highlight the word multiply to help me remember that common ratio means multiply by the same number. Again, with common ratios, to help you go from number to number, you can allow your brain to think in terms of division, but the way we write common ratios is always in terms of multiplication. So again, in lesson 1.1D, understanding how you distinguish these two terms from one another is important. You need to understand that common difference is always adding or subtracting the same number, and common ratio is always multiplying by the same number, and that we write it in terms of multiplication. Finally, in lesson 1.1D, we explored how functions change. So instead of using the word change, which is kind of common knowledge, we use a more fancy term called transformation. So how functions change, is by what we call a series of transformations. So I'm going to write the word transformation in here. And again, because this is a key vocabulary word, I'm going to get out my yellow highlighter and highlight the word transformations. So you have explored these transformations in your past math classes, but by mainly using specific, shapes on the coordinate plane, or just shapes in general. What I'm pushing you to do in algebra is still understand these different types of transformations, but now use them to help us describe how different graphs are being compared to where they originally started out as. So like in the past, there are four main types of transformations. The first one helps us shift up, down, left, and right. So that first type of transformation is what's called a translation. So when we translate a graph, we will be either shifting it up, down, left, or right from the original. And sometimes it's a combination of these different directions. It could shift up and left, or it could shift down and right. The second transformation then helps us flip over either the x or the y-axis. So the term that we're looking for, flipping over something or mirroring something, is called a reflection. So again, sometimes our graphs will reflect over the x or reflect over the y from the original way that it looked on the coordinate plane. A third type of transformation is when we take a graph and we turn it a number of degrees. So anytime we turn something, we do what's called a rotation. We won't be talking a whole bunch about rotations here in our class or in algebra, but this is something that you'll have to know and understand, especially in geometry. So that's why we still kind of cover it. But knowing that rotation means you're turning a graph or you're turning it a certain number of degrees is going to be important. And then finally, the last transformation that we're going to cover is what's called dilating or dilation. So you're either enlarging or reducing the original figure, shape, or image. And so what we call that in algebra is a stretch or a shrink. So here we have it, our four main transformations that help us see how our functions or our graphs on the coordinate change. The three main ones that we're really going to explore in depth in algebra this year are translations, reflections, and stretches/shrinks. Again, we're going to need to touch base or hit on the word rotation, but you're really not going to explore that in depth again like you did in 8th grade math until geometry. So we're really going to hit home the first three that I start here: translations, reflections, and stretch and shrinks. So with that being said, that covers the last of our lessons for this summary notes episode. So make sure that you have everything recorded that I went through in these videos. Make sure you take a picture as proof that you finished so you can go ahead and upload to the assignment and move on to the next thing in Canvas.